The reason we're here. Pardon?
Just come a bit closer to the mic to the camera.
Once again, thanks very much for coming this morning. The reason we're here is to explain how Fianna Fáil is going to use its private members' time tomorrow evening in the Dáil. We're using it for the purpose of having the second stage debate on the bail amendment bill that was introduced by Fianna Fáil a number of months ago. You may recall that back in 1996 the people voted by referendum to allow the law to be changed so that bail could be refused if there was a concern that an individual who was applying for bail was likely to commit another criminal offence. After that, we've had some statutes introduced with the Bail Act in 1997, and we've had more recent legislation. However, there still is a problem in respect of people who are on bail committing serious offences. We know that in 2016 that 13% of all offences were committed by people who were out on bail. There's also a particular problem in respect of burglaries and aggravated burglaries. We also know from research done from the Irish Prison Service that over 70% of people who are in jail for burglary or aggravated burglary have previous convictions for those offences. The purpose of the legislation we're going to be debating tomorrow night is twofold. First of all, we want to change the law so that a court shall refuse bail when it has been applied for in respect of a serious criminal offence, if it is the case that the court believes that refusal is reasonably necessary to prevent the commission of a future serious criminal offence. So, for instance, if an individual already has a conviction for burglary or aggravated burglary, they come before the court seeking bail in respect of another charge of burglary or aggravated burglary. In those circumstances, the court shall refuse bail if it is the case that the court believes it's reasonably necessary to prevent the commission of future offences. There's also an alternative provided in the legislation. If it is the case that the court believes that bail shouldn't be granted, it is, however, permitted to grant bail if it believes that the individual will agree to being subject to electronic monitoring. Back in 2006 we had a Criminal Justice Act that was introduced which brought into our legal system the whole principle of electronic monitoring. It hasn't been used in any widespread extent. We know that it is used effectively in Northern Ireland, but down in the south it hasn't been used. Under the provisions of this bill, an individual in the circumstance I've just outlined would be able to seek and be granted bail, even if charged with a serious offence, provided that there was an agreement to be subject to electronic monitoring. That would ensure that the individual could be monitored so he could comply with the bail bond that required him not to commit any future criminal offences. So we think it is a necessary response. There's a serious issue throughout the country in respect of crime. Unfortunately, the government doesn't recognise the extent of the seriousness. If you travel around the country, you'll know that very many local communities are concerned about burglaries and aggravated burglaries, which have seen rises in certain regions of the country, and we think it is an appropriate legislative response to the legitimate concern that's out there, and it also reflects the responsibility on Oireachtas members to come up with proposals for the purpose of strengthening our law. So that's it.
Don't you know that the commission of future offences is something that's foreign to Irish law and probably repugnant to the Constitution with the principles of liberty and so on. I can't anticipate that you're going to break into a shop down the road at any time in the future.
You're right.
So your bill must be on consultation.
No, you'd be right if you were asking me that question back in 1995, Senan. But in 1996 we changed the Constitution, and prior to 1996, you're right, the law was governed by the O'Callaghan decision, which said bail cannot be used for the purpose of preventative justice. But we now changed the law. People can be refused bail in circumstances where the court believes there's a likelihood that there will be a commission of a future offence, and we have the empirical evidence to show that's going on. So I don't have any constitutional concerns about it.
Jim, are there cost implications, resource implications, prison space, that kind of factor that you've considered?
Well, this is not going to apply in respect of every application for bail. It only applies for what's referred to as relevant offences, which are serious offences, and the serious offences are already scheduled in the Bail Act. So it's not going to result in a significant increase in the number of people in prison. In terms of cost, there may be a cost in terms of getting further electronic monitoring available. However, that's something that's been on our statute law since 2006. And we need to start recognising that it isn't some draconian measure. It is certainly to the benefit of a person applying for bail that they can be let out subject to electronic monitoring rather than being incarcerated.
Jim, just in relation to a presidential election? Are Fianna Fáil considering fielding a candidate, and how long?
Well, I think what we've said previously is that we're going to wait to see what the President has to say in respect of it. I think the office of President deserves the dignity of being given space. President Higgins has indicated that he'll make his decision next month. When we hear his decision as a party, we will meet, we'll discuss it. It's obviously a matter for the leadership, for the front bench, for the parliamentary party. But we'll make a decision when that happens after the President makes his decision.
So the party's still open to maybe deciding if they would field a candidate or not?
We haven't ruled anything in, we haven't ruled anything out.
What do you think yourself personally, Jim? Would you be in favour of the presidential election?
Well, I've said previously, Joe, that I think President Higgins is doing a very good job. I'd like to see him serve another 7 years, but it's not a decision for me. I don't think many people are putting themselves forward as of yet, and my own personal view, this isn't a party view, is that if President Higgins puts himself forward, I think the convention that has happened before, whereby a sitting president gets a second term, will apply.
Is that a reasonable position to hold, though, in a democracy where all citizens are supposed to be equal? Yet here's a citizen who wants 2 goes at a 7-year term with a splendid pension and an enviable salary.
Well, I think it's a reasonable position for me to have a personal opinion, which I've just expressed. Also, the Constitution is very clear. You need 20 members of the Oireachtas to nominate you, or you need 4 county councils. It's open to anyone to get that. And if people want to get the nominations of 20 members of the Oireachtas, I'm sure they can do that if they want to.
Yeah.
No one here is interested in running, by the way. I just want to confirm that.
Focus on the current job.
Constituents say that crime is a massive issue. What sort of stories are you hearing back to Fianna Fáil, and why do you think the government has their head in the sand about it?
Well, it's not an easy issue. That's part of the reason. And we have a government that likes to deal with, some issues that may be more popular than others. But at present, I was at a meeting in Carlow last night. I've been at meetings in Cavan. I've been meetings in Tralee. I've been around the country. It is a very big issue. Big crowds come to the meetings. They're not coming there to see me. They're coming there because they have a concern about rural crime and Garda resources. So, people are concerned. And burglaries, you may talk statistically whether burglaries are up or they're down. But the reality is, if people have been subjected to burglary, it's a major issue for them. And it's also a concern for the local community in respect to Garda resources.
I think as well, from a rural perspective, the message coming back loud and clear is that offences, particularly burglary offences, aggravated burglary, are not being taken seriously enough. And the question time and time again is, when somebody is convicted and we look at the vast history sometimes of these criminals and the other offences that they have committed and been convicted for, the question being asked is, well, they were out on bail, why were they out on bail, why are they reoffending, what is the state doing to protect us? In rural communities, in my own constituency in Mayo, the feeling among citizens is that they don't have that protection and that they are there to protect themselves. So we need to get tough on crime. We need to deal with these serious offences seriously. And this is a situation where we have somebody that has previously committed a serious offence and is back before the courts on another alleged serious offence. And I think in that instance, where we're talking about a bail application, it is reasonable to suggest that the courts would take that into account and act accordingly. And we are giving an alternative option there, that electronic monitoring can be used and is available already in the state. So we're either serious about getting tough on these types of crimes or we're not. And Fianna Fáil is serious about getting tough on these crimes, because everybody should feel safe in their home.
While definitely over the last couple of years there's been a significant slide in terms of crime, and while I have to acknowledge and admit that the Gardaí have done an incredible job with serious gangland crime, but yet in all of our constituencies in the Dublin area, and it's very prevalent, the issue of drug dealing continues today, harassment and intimidation. We've spoken and we've raised it time and time again, the whole issue of antisocial behaviour. The lives of people, just ordinary residents in their own homes, are being blighted. And while we talk about the Gardaí and the strength of the Gardaí, and the Minister was quick to point out that the number of Gardaí increased last year by over 600, but there was no increase in the Dublin area. So some of these issues are continuing in our communities, and I think, quite honestly, both the Minister and the Government are missing the point. I attend the JPC regularly, and the issues are becoming more and more serious.
John, you were speaking earlier about traffic on the M50. Would you support calls for a second motorway to tackle congestion?
I believe the traffic on the M50 at the moment is at levels that was estimated to happen in 2025 or thereabouts, and we're in 2018. There is no further scope or no further capacity on the M50, and I believe it's about time that we looked at alternatives, and in my view that includes the possibility of an outer ring road west of the M50. It's worth noting that each year for the last number of years, traffic on the M50 increased by 7 or 8%, as did, by the way, the people using public transport. It's all growing, and congestion times are growing. It is costing us hundreds of millions per annum on traffic congestion in Dublin alone. So I believe as a serious project it should be investigated, and investigated in tandem with where our housing developments are. I made the point this morning, there are 2 SDZs in my own area developing, one with 10,000 housing units and one with 8,500 housing units. An outer orbital route would be a significant investment, would take several years, but we have to have a vision of where we see Dublin in 10 and 20 years' time. It does not replace public transport, but adds to the infrastructure that I believe is necessary.
Shane Ross made a shocking observation yesterday that many of those who are blocking his bill or holding up, he believes, are lawyers. And he named you, Michael McDougall, possibly in the chat. What do you say to that really there are the numbers? Can we not get over the line?
I don't really want to personalise it. Shane sometimes has a tendency to try to personalise an argument. I've always asked for one answer to one question. What is the public benefit in having a majority of people on a commission to advise the government about the appointment of judges when the majority of people do not have the knowledge of who the appropriate candidates were? If there was a job as political editor going in RT or in one of your newspapers, and if the 3 of us were put in the panel and the majority were politicians, what would you think? You'd think that's ludicrous. Why don't we have people who know how newspapers operate? Why don't we know people who how journalism operates? But instead we've got this fiction from Shane that says it's a very good thing to have a majority of lay people on a board. It doesn't happen in England and Wales. It doesn't happen in Scotland. It doesn't happen in Northern Ireland. And notwithstanding Shane's repeated personalised references to people being opposed to it because they're lawyers, the reason I'm opposed to it is because it's a really silly idea. But unfortunately, he doesn't wake up to that. And you have a government who are asleep at the wheel and are prepared to give him what he wants just to keep him on side.
But are there not political appointments when it comes to judges? Is that not evident in terms of support from different parties? What's your view of that?
Can I just say, I introduced legislation back in 2016 with the support of Fianna Fáil, and the purpose was to deal with a problem that existed at some levels in the appointment of judges, because it was unquestionably the case that previously, at certain levels, some judges were appointed because they had connections. There's no doubt about that. And the way to resolve that is to try to reduce the power that the Cabinet had for the purpose of appointing people, and to place more reliance on the advisory board that's made up of judges. Now that's a sensible idea, but instead Shane comes in and decides, okay, he's got trouble with politicians, but then with the other hand and the other stick he says, I'm going to start beating judges as well. Like, the logic of trying to ensure that we have a good system is to have a large number of judges, a majority judges on the panel. I'm not just saying that, the European Commission is saying that, Greco has stated it. And we all just fall asleep and say, sure, this is irrelevant, let Shane have it, sure, we got the step aside Garda station. Whatever about step aside Garda station, let him have that little frolic. But the idea that we're going to change the method whereby judges are appointed for another one of his frolics is nonsensical, and it reflects very badly on the Taoiseach and the government. Thanks.
Thanks everybody.
Quite perfect.